Hi, everybody, and welcome to the third Ed puzzle, which is on cycles. So we're going to cover a couple different cycles, and the first one we're going to cover is the carbon cycle. Here are your objectives, your EKs, and your skills. So the thing that you need to know about cycles is that we're going to cover these more in depth in different units throughout the year. So this should be a good overview for you. This should be a review a bit from other courses, and then we're going to move forward from there. So your carbon cycle is your movement of carbon in the atmosphere and the geosphere and the hydrosphere and the biosphere. So of the carbon cycle, you have a lot of sources and sinks. Some steps are very quick, like combusting fossil fuels, burning coal, oil, natural gas, and some are really slow, like sedimentation and burial. So here is your general carbon cycle and a bunch of different routes that carbon can actually take. So because some of these routes are faster and some of them are slower, we have an imbalance in reservoirs. And so some are storing more carbon and some are storing less carbon at different times. So the atmosphere is the key carbon reservoir. So increasing levels of carbon in the atmosphere leads to global warming. And that's not debated. That's science. We have our climate is increasing. Our average Earth temperature is increasing. The debate comes in: is it human caused or not? But we know that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere is increasing our Earth's average temperature. So your carbon sink is the carbon reservoir that stores more carbon than it releases. So the ocean, with its algae and its sediments and plants and soil, is actually a huge carbon sink, taking in a lot of carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. So a carbon source is adding carbon into the atmosphere. When we burn coal, oil, natural gas, or fossil fuels, animal agriculture, especially raising cows, farting and belching of the cows releases a lot of methane, which is also a greenhouse gas. And deforestation releases carbon dioxide from trees through that process of decomposition and also through the process of burning. So photosynthesis and cellular respiration are two of the main pillars of the carbon cycle. So photosynthesis is completed by plants, algae, phytoplankton. It removes carbon from the atmosphere, converts it into glucose, and then your glucose C6H12O6 is that actually stored energy. Okay? Photosynthesis converts things into carbon sinks. Cellular respiration, is the opposite. It's also done by plants. Remember, we were talking about that net versus primary productivity. So you had that cellular respiration and it releases the stored energy. We respire, and all animals do. We use oxygen to break down that glucose in our bodies. And then what we do is we breathe out carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. So this carbon dioxide source adds carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So both of these processes are very quick. So there's really no net increase in atmosphere, even if you're like, well, now we have 7 billion people and there were more people than there were last year. So we're putting more carbon into the atmosphere. It's negligible because of the process of photosynthesis. In the ocean and the atmosphere, you have that direct exchange of carbon dioxide. It's very quickly in equal directions, and it balances levels between the ocean and the atmosphere of carbon dioxide. Increasing carbon dioxide increases ocean carbon dioxide, and that leads to ocean acidification, which is bad. We get to that into the end of the year. Algae and phytoplankton are great in that they photosynthesize and they take that carbon dioxide and they fix it into sugars. Coral reefs and marine algae with shells take that carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. They make it into their skeletons, those calcium carbonate exoskeletons. They need carbon dioxide for that. And when sedimentation is when marine organisms die, when things settle to the bottom, they sink. They're broken down into sediments that contain carbon, and then over long periods of time, they're buried. You have pressure, you have more sediments, and those are long-term carbon reservoirs, and we call that burial. So this is your burial that stores carbon in underground sinks, very slow, sedimentary rock. You have time, you have pressure, you have water that compacts it. Fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas are formed from fossilized remains of organisms. So coal is more formed in marshes and bogs, and oil and natural gas usually are found together, and we find those with in more areas that used to be marine. Here's your image. So extraction and combustion is where we're digging them up, we're mining these fossil fuels, we burn them as an energy source, and that releases the carbon dioxide into the air through the process of combustion. So that burial, that formation of those fossil fuels takes a lot longer than it does for us to light it up. And there's a big net carbon exchange into the atmosphere from the amount of fossil fuels that we're burning, because we're burning them way faster than they are being created, which is why they are considered non-renewable resources. So here is your first practice FRQ. Identify one process in the diagram that happens quickly and one process that happens slowly. Explain how the rate at which fossil fuels are transferred into the atmosphere, as shown in the diagram, has altered the carbon cycle during the past 250 years. 250 years. So when human population really, really started to increase and we started getting into that industrial revolution. Nitrogen cycle. Objectives, EKs, and skills. So here's your overview for the nitrogen cycle. The nitrogen cycle is a pain in the butt, but you have these same things, the sources and the sinks. And the sources will release nitrogen into the atmosphere and sinks take it out of the atmosphere. Nitrogen reservoirs actually hold nitrogen for relatively short periods of time compared to the carbon cycle, because the nitrogen cycle is a lot in organisms, in plants and animals. So the atmosphere is the main nitrogen reservoir. 78% of our atmosphere is N2 gas. It's not usable by plants or animals in that form, which is weird because we all need nitrogen. So in our DNA, our amino acids, things like that, proteins are made of nitrogen, so we need a lot of it, which is crazy because the majority of it is an unusable form. So basically, how do we get it into a usable form? And that's fixing it. So nitrogen fixation happens, and that's the process of it being converted into a usable form, a biologically available form, either NH3 ammonia or NO3 minus, which is your nitrate. So certain bacteria do nitrogen fixation. They're in a symbiotic relationship, a mutualistic symbiotic relationship in root nodules, and that converts N2 into ammonia. All right, so if you see up here, the little blue circles, you have atmospheric nitrogen, which then is converted into ammonium and ammonia through the process of nitrogen fixing bacteria in these root nodules. Okay, we also do synthetic fixation, which is when humans combust fossil fuels and you convert that N2 gas into nitrate, which then is a usable form. Also, these nitrogen fixing bacteria, they're found in legumes. Okay, this organization of plants or family of plants. Peas and beans and clover all have nitrogen fixing bacteria on their roots, which is why if you have a really green lawn, you most likely have some clover in there, because clover is literally fixing the nitrogen from the atmosphere into a usable form. Okay. Nitrates are added into synthetic fertilizers like Miracle-Gro. They're used in agriculture. Their base is fossil fuels. You burn fossil fuels to get it. Right. Other nitrogen cycle steps, you have assimilation. That's when the plants and animals take it in and incorporate it into their bodies. And the other thing is that the way that plants get nutrients assimilated is the nutrients have to be dissolved in water. And then the plants take up that water that has dissolved nutrients in it, which is always something that people get tripped up with that. Ammonification is done by soil bacteria, microbes, and decomposers. They convert waste and dead biomass back into NH3 and return it into the soil. So it's a type of decomposition. So here you go. That's your green. And then your nitrification is when you convert that NH4 into nitrate and then nitrate. And again, this is done by soil bacteria. You have 3 different steps out of 5 possible steps of the nitrogen cycle that are done through soil bacteria. Okay. And then denitrification is the conversion of soil into nitrous oxide gas, which then returns it to the atmosphere in just a different form. And that is your reddish color. So human impacts. Nitrous oxide is a greenhouse gas. It warms Earth climate. So that is produced by the denitrification of nitrate in agricultural soils, especially when they're waterlogged or overwatered, which is in a lot of areas because we don't have really great agricultural practices in a lot of areas in the world. Ammonia volatilization, which is when excess fertilizer use, that it basically volatilizes. And it turns into it vaporizes essentially. That's what volatilization is. And when you have that new car smell, that's VOCs, volatile organic compounds. And what happens is there's just too much on the field. It's not all going to sink in, and it kind of floats away. It's a respiratory irritant in a lot of animals and humans. And that means less nitrogen stays in the soil for crops to use. So if you're a farmer and you're only really needing 50, but you put down 100, you're paying for that extra 50 and getting no benefit out of it. Then we have leaching and eutrophication. So synthetic fertilizer use leads to these nutrients leaching. They're carried out of the soil by water, and then they run off into local waterways. They cause algal blooms. That blocks the sun. It kills other aquatic plants. The whole process of that is called eutrophication. Here is your practice FRQ. Describe one chemical transformation that occurs in the natural nitrogen cycle and explain the importance of that transformation to an ecosystem. Phosphorus cycle. Objectives, EKs, and skills. Phosphorus cycle is really slow, and the major reservoirs are rocks and sediments containing phosphorus, which is why it's really slow. The other thing about this is that there is no gaseous phase. So it never enters the atmosphere. You might have some wind-blown dust, but that's not a gaseous form. Okay, it takes a long time for these phosphorus minerals to be washed out and weathered out of rocks and carried into bodies of water. So a lot of times it's a limiting nutrient in the environment. So think back to your chemistry, your limiting reagent is what's going to stop your reaction from happening. So a lot of times this phosphorus, plants will need phosphorus and they'll get to this point, and then they could go further, but they just don't have enough phosphorus. So phosphorus, though, is needed by all organisms for DNA, ATP, bone and tooth in enamel in some animals. Ooh. Different sources. This is rocks, weathering of rocks that contain phosphorus. Your wind and your rain break down, and it gets dissolved into water. And you have synthetic sources of phosphorus, which we mine phosphate minerals. We add them to products like synthetic fertilizers, detergents, and cleaners. And then what happens is that runoff again takes that phosphorus, it runs into nearby bodies of water. We're talking here about plant nutrients. So if you're putting nitrates and phosphates on your crops, you want to make them grow. When nitrates and phosphates run off into bodies of water, it makes plants that are in the water grow. In most cases, it's phytoplankton. And what happens is when you get an overabundance of plankton, it's not good. Of algae, rather, should I say. It's not good. So what you end up getting is the process of eutrophication, which I swear we go over somewhere in here. All right. So just like nitrogen, phosphorus is absorbed by the plant roots, it assimilates into tissues. Animal waste, plant matter, and other biomass is broken down by bacterial soil decomposers, and that returns the phosphate to the soil. Okay, so this is like a mini loop within the phosphorus cycle, just like in the nitrogen cycle, and respiration and photosynthesis in the carbon cycle, like mini cycles within cycles. Then you have sedimentation and geologic uplift. So since phosphate doesn't dissolve very well in water, a lot of it just kind of stays solid, and that's your sedimentation, just like your fossil fuel formation. So you have long periods of time, you have that pressure of their overlaying of rock and water, and then what happens is geologic uplift with your tectonic plates, it's going to bring stored carbon up to the surface, and then you start that process over again of weathering and erosion. Here's the eutrophication. I swore it was in there somewhere. So nitrates and phosphates, when we put too much on our lawns, our crops, our gardens, it rains and it runs off into bodies of water. So now these bodies of water have excess nutrients in them that are typically limiting factors. And you get the process of eutrophication. So here are your steps. It's a nutrient. So algae are now like sweet buffet, and you get these algal blooms. It covers the surface of the water. It blocks the sunlight, so now plants underneath can't photosynthesize. And then the algae die off because they have a short lifespan. And then you have bacteria that are breaking down these algae in the decomposition process, which takes up oxygen and it creates carbon dioxide. So now you have very low oxygens in your lake or pond, and now fish can't survive because there's not enough oxygen. And that's the whole positive feedback loop of almost like the runaway train reaction of one thing happens and then another thing happens and then another thing happens. And that whole process is eutrophication. So here is a really nice visual with steps of how this happens. So you can always pause and take a look at this. Here's your other practice FRQ. Choose two reservoirs depicted in the diagram above and describe how phosphorus moves from one to the other. Okay, so phosphorus. Last cycle, the hydrologic cycle, which is the water cycle. Objectives, EKs, and skills. And here's your overview. You have the same thing, sources and sinks. You have three different states of matter, your solid, your liquid, your gas. And those are key in the water cycle with moving it. So you have your precipitation in the atmosphere, and then it goes into land with your surface water, with your condensation, it falls as precipitation. Energy from the sun drives the water cycle because it's driving it from a gaseous form to a liquid form to a gaseous form. And you have no sun and it's frozen. So the sun plays a major, major role in the water cycle. The ocean is our largest reservoir. 97% of the water on our earth is salt water. Our ocean covers 75% of our earth. Of the 3% of the water on earth that is freshwater, the large majority of that is frozen in ice caps. Groundwater is smaller reservoirs, but they contain fresh, usable water for humans. Evaporation and evapotranspiration. These are the two main sources of water, like the processes that cycle it. We call it sometimes vaporization because the liquid water becomes water vapor. Transpiration is like leaf sweat. What happens is the plants will pull groundwater up from their roots up to their leaves, and a lot of it actually comes out of their stomata, which are the undersides of the leaves. You have these opening from the Greek word stoma, meaning mouth. And this movement of water creates this water potential, kind of this capillary action constantly pulling it up and out. Evapotranspiration is the amount of water that enters the atmosphere from transpiration and evaporation combined. So transpiration from leaves versus evaporation from the soil, that whole thing together is your evapotranspiration. And again, driven by the sun. Runoff and infiltration here. So when rain falls, it's either going to flow over the Earth's surface, runoff into some sort of lake, river, stream, something. If you've seen Finding Nemo, all drains lead to the ocean. It's true. Or what happens is it infiltrates into the soil and it soaks down into the soil and it replenishes groundwater aquifers. These aquifers, your surface water, lakes and rivers, are really important freshwater reservoirs for humans and for animals. And here you have permeability. That's basically just how much goes through the surface of something. If it's soil, a lot of that water is going to flow into the ground and replenish aquifers. And if you have like a paved surface, what's going to happen is most of that is going to run off. It might get into some cracks and seams and things like that, but water's not going to be able to pass through. So here is your, let me go back to this one. Runoff recharges surface waters, but it can also carry pollutants into these surface waters. And then if you have aquifers with a lot of pollution on top of it, what happens is that pollution can actually infiltrate down into the groundwater as well. Here's your last FRQ. Choose a process from the diagram above and identify the process and describe how water is moving from one reservoir to another. Make sure you say whether you're choosing A, B, C, or D for that.